My name is Claire Maddox. I'm 34 years old, and I want to tell you about the 11 days I was unconscious and what my family did while they thought I was dying. I'm going to tell you everything. The will reading, the notary, the phone call I wasn't awake to witness, but that changed the course of every single life in that room. But before I get there, hit like, subscribe, and drop your city below. I read every comment, and I need you to stay with me for this one, because the ending took me 2 years to understand. The accident happened on a Thursday in October. I don't remember the impact. I don't remember the road, or the rain, or the fact that it was 6:42 in the evening when a pickup truck ran a red light on Route 9 in Harlow, Pennsylvania, and hit the driver's side of my car, going 48 miles an hour. I know these details because my attorney told me later. She pulled the accident report, the hospital records, the exact timestamp on the 911 call. She is thorough like that. Her name is Pauline Reese. She's been my attorney for 4 years. She matters enormously to this story. What I do know is that I woke up 11 days later in the ICU at Harlow Regional with a shattered clavicle, 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and a traumatic brain injury that the doctors told my family gave me a 40% chance of full recovery. 40%. My family heard that number and started making plans. Let me tell you who my family is. My mother is Diane Maddox. She is 61 years old, 3 inches shorter than me, and has the specific talent of making every room feel like a job interview. She is not cruel exactly. She is calculating. Warmth comes to her the way a second language does. She can manage it in short bursts. It doesn't feel natural. My brother is Preston. He's 38, 2 years older, significantly louder, and has spent most of his adult life trying to become the version of himself our father always expected. He sells commercial real estate. He's good at it. He wears that success like a second skin, just tight enough that he can never quite breathe easy. And then there's my father, Gerald Maddox, retired civil engineer, 64. He and my mother divorced when I was 19. They are not close, but money has a way of bringing people back into the same room. The money in question was my grandmother's estate. My grandmother, Ruth Bellamy, my mother's mother, died 14 months before my accident. She was 82. She had lived a full and exact life, and she left behind an estate valued at approximately $1.4 million. A house in Lancaster, a vacation property on Chesapeake Bay, savings accounts, a small investment portfolio that her late husband had started in 1974 and which had been quietly growing ever since. Ruth was methodical. She had a financial advisor, an estate attorney, and a very clear idea of who she trusted with what she'd built. Not because I was her favorite. I'm careful about saying that. She loved all of us, but she trusted me specifically because 3 years before she died, she called me on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "Claire, I need you to sit with me while I do something important." We sat at her kitchen table for 4 hours while her attorney walked her through a revocable living trust. I held her hand when she signed her name. I brought her tea. I asked questions she hadn't thought to ask. Preston was golfing that day. My mother had a nail appointment. My grandmother noticed. 14 months later, she was gone, and she left the majority of her estate, the Chesapeake property, the investment portfolio, and $340,000 in liquid assets in a trust, with me as the primary beneficiary and trustee. Her house in Lancaster went to my mother. A $75,000 bequest went to Preston. It was generous. It was fair. It was also, apparently, not enough. I know this because in the 8 months between Ruth's death and my accident, I heard things. Preston's comment at Easter that the Chesapeake property should stay in the family, not with the family accountant. My mother's tightening expression every time I mentioned my grandmother. A phone call I accidentally walked into the tail end of. Preston's voice through my kitchen doorway, low and focused, saying, "There has to be a way to challenge the terms." There wasn't, but they didn't stop looking for one. And then in October, a pickup truck ran a red light. I was unconscious for 11 days. In that time, my family did the following. They contacted the hospital to be listed as my emergency contacts. That was appropriate. I had no husband, no children. My closest friend, a woman named Sable Torres, drove up from Baltimore the night of the accident. But she wasn't family in the legal sense. They also contacted an attorney. Not mine, theirs. His name was Douglas Farr. Preston had used him in a previous business dispute. He was, by all accounts, a competent man who asked very few questions when the fees were sufficient. Douglas Farr had a theory. The theory went like this. If I died, and the odds were not nothing, the trust I held as trustee would need a successor trustee immediately. And if there were grounds to challenge my mental competence at the time I accepted the trustee role, or if certain procedural documents had not been properly filed, the trust could potentially be contested, reopened, redistributed. It was a thin theory. My grandmother's estate attorney had been practicing for 30 years. The trust was ironclad, but thin was enough for them to act. On day 4 of my unconsciousness, they scheduled a will reading. Not my grandmother's will. That had already been probated. This was a meeting to go over the trust documents, the succession paperwork, what would happen to the assets I controlled if I didn't wake up, or if I woke up and was, in Douglas Farr's delicate phrasing, significantly cognitively diminished. The meeting took place in a conference room on the 2nd floor of Harlow Regional, 60 feet from where I was breathing through a machine. They brought a notary. Her name was Evelyn Marsh, and nobody in that room paid enough attention to her. Evelyn Marsh had been a licensed notary for 19 years. She worked part-time out of a UPS store on Cedar Avenue, part-time for a legal services firm downtown, and occasionally she was called in for hospital signings. Documents that needed witnessing when someone was recovering, when time was short, when family members needed paperwork formalized. She had done hundreds of these. She had a quiet competence about her. She carried a navy canvas bag with her seal and ink, and a logbook she'd maintained in the same handwriting since 2006. What Douglas Farr's office did not know, what nobody thought to check, was that Evelyn Marsh had been present at Ruth Bellamy's trust signing 4 years earlier. She had notarized the original documents at the kitchen table. She had watched my grandmother's hand move across 3 pages of legal text. She had spoken briefly with the young woman who brought Ruth tea and asked the questions nobody else thought to ask. She remembered me. I'm going to be honest with you about something. I don't know exactly what happened in that conference room. I was unconscious 60 feet away. What I know comes from 3 sources. Evelyn herself, who spoke to Pauline Reese in extraordinary detail. A partial account from a hospital administrator who briefly entered the room, and eventually, reluctantly, from my brother Preston. They gathered in the conference room at 2 p.m. on day 4. My mother, Preston, my father Gerald, who had been called in by Preston, which tells you something about the stakes, and Douglas Farr. Evelyn was there to notarize whatever documents Farr intended to formalize. The documents Farr had prepared were a declaration of anticipated incapacity, a legal instrument meant to establish a framework for successor trustee appointment if I died or was declared incompetent. It was procedurally aggressive. It named Preston as the successor trustee. My grandmother's trust did not name Preston as the successor trustee. It named Pauline Reese. Evelyn Marsh opened her logbook. She scanned the first document Farr slid across the table. She did what notaries do. She read carefully, she checked names, she verified the instrument against her records, and she found the name. Claire Maddox, trustee, Bellamy Family Living Trust. She had notarized that trust. The original establishment of it. She had the entry in her logbook. She knew the designated successor trustee because she had witnessed that page signed too. Evelyn said nothing. Not yet. She asked to use the restroom. She stepped into the hallway. She called Pauline Reese. The call lasted 4 minutes and 31 seconds. I know because Pauline saved the record. Evelyn went back into the conference room, collected her bag, and told Douglas Farr she was unable to notarize the documents. She cited a conflict of interest. Farr pushed back. Evelyn was polite, precise, and completely immovable. She left. Without notarization, the declaration Farr had prepared was unenforceable. Without that document, there was no procedural basis to appoint Preston's successor trustee. Without that appointment, the trust sat exactly as Ruth Bellamy had intended it. With me. Pauline Reese filed a protective order on the trust assets the following morning. She notified the estate court. She documented the meeting, the attempted filing, and Evelyn's account. Then she drove to Harlow Regional and sat in the waiting room. She was there when I woke up. Coming back from unconsciousness is not like the movies. There's no clean moment where your eyes open and you're suddenly yourself. It's slower than that. It's sounds before sight. A persistent beeping that seems to come from inside your skull. A pressure behind your eyes. Voices that feel like they're arriving from another room. I knew I was in a hospital before I knew why. I knew someone was holding my hand. It was Sable. She barely left before I could form the question of where I was. I surfaced in pieces over the course of a morning. By afternoon, I could hold a conversation. By evening, Pauline was in my room. She didn't tell me everything at once. She's smart enough to know that wasn't the right move. She told me I was safe, that the trust was safe. She told me we would talk when I was ready. I was ready the next morning. She sat in the chair beside my bed and told me exactly what had happened. All of it. The conference room, the documents, Evelyn Marsh, the phone call. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. The thing I kept coming back to was the image of that room. My mother, my brother, my father, a man who hadn't been in the same space as my mother voluntarily in 15 years, sitting around a conference table 60 feet from where I was alive on machines, working through paperwork about what to do with my grandmother's estate if I didn't survive. Not if, assuming. My mother later told me she was grieving, that the meeting was a practical necessity, that families have to plan for worst-case scenarios. Maybe, but you don't fly in a real estate attorney and a notary on day 4 if you're grieving. You do that if you're moving. I was in the hospital for another 9 days after I woke up. Physical therapy for the shoulder. Neurological assessments. A succession of doctors who asked me to track their fingers with my eyes and told me I was, in the end, one of the 40%. My family came to see me. My mother on day 2, she brought flowers, white roses, which she knows I don't like, but she always buys anyway. She sat for 40 minutes and talked about logistics, my apartment, my car, whether the insurance would cover the damages. She didn't mention the conference room. Preston came on day 4. He was dressed like he'd come from work, which I suspect he had. He stood near the window. He asked how I was feeling. He was careful with his sentences in a way Preston very rarely is. He's a man who talks with his hands, who leans in, who fills rooms with his certainty. Standing near that window, he was contained, stiff. He didn't mention the conference room either. My father came on day 6. He brought a gas station coffee and a paperback mystery novel. He's always been the one who copes with awkward situations through objects. He set both on my bedside table. He said, "I want you to know I didn't fully understand what Preston was asking me to be part of." I looked at him. "But you went." I went. He left without saying much else. I thought about that for a long time. I left the hospital on a Thursday. Sable drove me home. She'd already cleaned my apartment, stocked my fridge, put fresh sheets on the bed. That is who Sable is. She doesn't ask. She just shows up. I slept for 12 hours. In the morning, I called Pauline. Here is what I want you to understand. I had not prepared for this the way the story might suggest. I had not, like some chess player, arranged every piece knowing exactly how the board would move. I was 34 years old when the accident happened. I had a trust I managed, a career I was building, an apartment I loved on the second floor of a building with good light and a view of a park. I had not planned to be hit by a truck. What I had done, what my grandmother had taught me to do, was take legal preparation seriously. When Pauline set up the trust structures after Ruth's death, I had read every document. I had asked questions. I had understood who was named and why and what the protections meant. Pauline had named herself successor trustee because I had asked her to. Because I trusted her judgment over anyone else's. That was it. That was the whole thing. Not a trap, not a performance. Just a choice I'd made with a clear head in a lawyer's office 18 months before a truck ran a red light. And because of that choice, Evelyn Marsh had a name to cross-reference. And because of that name, she made a phone call. Sometimes protection looks like foresight. And sometimes foresight just looks like doing your paperwork right. Now let me tell you what happened next, because the conference room meeting wasn't just a failed attempt. It had consequences Douglas Farr apparently hadn't fully thought through. Pauline had documented everything: the meeting, the attempted filing, the documents Farr had prepared. She shared that documentation with the estate court that oversaw Ruth's trust. The court reviewed the attempted declaration of incapacity and the named appointment of Preston as successor trustee. There were problems with that document that went beyond procedure. The declaration had been filed, or rather attempted to be filed, while I was unconscious and unable to consent, refute, or have legal representation present. That alone was a significant issue. But more specifically, the language Farr had used in the document implied I had previously indicated a desire to name Preston as my successor. I had made no such indication, ever, to anyone. That language was fabricated. In the legal world, this falls into a territory that no competent attorney wants to be near. Douglas Farr received a letter from the estate court 3 weeks after I was discharged. He received a separate notice from the state bar. Preston received a call from Farr that same week. I know because Preston called me 40 minutes after it happened. He didn't lead with an apology. Preston doesn't work that way. He led with the information. Farr was stepping back from the case. The bar complaint was under review. There might be additional inquiries from the court. Then, after a silence, he said, "I think I made a mistake." I let the silence sit. "Yeah," I said, "you did." We didn't say much after that. I told him I'd let him know if there was anything he needed to do from a legal standpoint. He said okay. He sounded like a man who had been very confident about something and was now standing in the space where that confidence used to be. My mother called me 2 days later. It was a longer conversation, more complicated. That when the doctors gave her that 40% number, something in her mind had shifted into a mode she wasn't proud of. That she had let Preston make the plans, because making plans gave her something to do, and she didn't know how to just sit with the fear of losing me. I listened. I believed part of it. The part I kept returning to was the speed. Day 4. They had moved on day 4. I had been unconscious for 96 hours, and my mother had already been in a room with a real estate attorney going over my grandmother's estate documents. Brief that moves that fast is usually pointed at something. I didn't say that to her. I said that I understood she was scared. I said that what they had done still needed to be named for what it was. She was quiet. Then she said she knew. That's as close to an acknowledgement as I ever got from my mother about what happened in that room. I decided it would have to be enough. Douglas Farr ultimately received a formal reprimand from the state bar. The matter of the fabricated language in the declaration document was reviewed and found to be an ethical violation. Not a criminal one, but significant. He was required to complete an ethics course and was placed on a 12-month supervision period. The bar process is slow and quiet, and most people never know it happened. The neighborhood where Douglas Farr's office sits is small enough that people talk. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Evelyn Marsh. I want to spend a moment here because she deserves it. I met her in person 3 months after I was discharged. Pauline set it up. We met at a coffee shop on Cedar Avenue, 2 blocks from the UPS store where she keeps her notary seal. She was in her late 50s, compact and serious. With reading glasses she kept taking on and off throughout our conversation. She told me she had almost not said anything. That the professional default is neutrality. Witness and certify. Don't interfere. That she had sat in that conference room for 4 minutes before she decided she needed to make the call. I asked her what made her decide. She thought about it for a moment. I remembered your grandmother, she said. I remembered how careful she was, how specific. She had thought about every line of those documents. And what was in front of me in that conference room, it wasn't what she had intended. A pause. I've notarized a lot of documents. You can usually tell when something is what somebody wanted and when it's what somebody else wanted for them. I thanked her. She said the coffee was good and she needed to get back to her afternoon. That was it. 4 minutes on a phone. 19 years of quiet competence. The whole thing turned on that. The trust is still intact. The Chesapeake property sits on a 1/4 acre of waterfront. In September, the bay turns a particular shade of gray-blue that my grandmother used to call the real color. I don't know exactly what she meant, but I think I'm beginning to. I've repaired the dock. I've started keeping a kayak in the boathouse. I manage the investment portfolio with Pauline's guidance. The $340,000 in liquid assets has been partially used, some of it toward my medical bills from the accident, which were significant. Some of it toward a full exterior repair on the Chesapeake property that my grandmother had been putting off. The rest sits where she left it, doing what she intended it to do. Preston and I talk. Not often, not easily, but we talk. He bought a house last spring, which he mentioned on the phone with the kind of deliberate lightness people use when they want you to know they're doing fine. I told him that was great. I meant it, mostly. My mother sends me things in the mail sometimes. Articles she thinks I'd like. A recipe once, which surprised me. It's her version of reaching. I write back. It's my version of not giving up. My father sends gas station coffee-level gestures now by text message. Blurry photos of things he finds interesting. A bird he saw. A book he finished. I respond. It's the most honest our relationship has ever been. Sable was in my wedding. I'm not getting married. I mean, she's the kind of person who will be in my wedding when it eventually happens. Because she's the person who drove 3 hours and cleaned my apartment and didn't ask a single thing in return. I've thought a lot about what to make of what happened. Not the legal parts. Those resolved the way they resolved. I mean the human parts. The part where I was unconscious, and the people who were supposed to love me moved into action. Not toward me, but around me, past me, toward the thing I was holding. I think about my grandmother at her kitchen table, the 4 hours, the tea, the questions nobody else thought to ask. She was not being sentimental about me. She was being accurate. She had watched long enough to know who was reliable. I got to be that person. That's not a trophy. That's not revenge. That's just being seen by someone who looked carefully before she wasn't around anymore to tell me what she'd seen. The notary made one phone call. My grandmother made the conditions for that call possible years before it happened. I just had to survive long enough to find out. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe. I'll be back with another story soon. If you have someone in your life who has quietly protected you, even after they were gone, I want to hear about it in the comments.